Sorry
Okay,
about
now,
that.
Chair.
Jumping the gun.
Take
Good
two.
morning. And welcome to the K-12 Higher Ed and CIP Joint Subcommittee. This morning, we will be listening to the State Public Works Division and our K-12 Nevada Department of Ed. And so I'd like to call the meeting to order, and would the secretary please call the roll?
Assemblywoman Benitez Thompson.
Here.
Assemblywoman Carlton.
I am here, thank you.
Assemblyman Frierson.
Here.
Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Here.
Assemblyman Hafen.
Here.
Assemblywoman Hudagi.
Here.
Assemblyman Levitt.
Here.
Assemblyman Roberts.
Here.
Senator Cannizzaro. Senator Kieckeffer.
Here.
Senator Ratty.
Here.
Senator Severs-Gansert.
Here.
Chair Don Darrell-Loop.
Here. And once again, good morning and welcome to all of you. And reminder that please turn off your mic when you're not speaking. And if you wish, you may join us on committee members. We'll have a Teams chat open. So if you have a question, but you can always do the hand wave and I'll watch for you. And we'll start out today with our first discussion from the State Public Works Division. And when they're ready, please go ahead.
Madam Chair, this is Brody Leiser with the Fiscal Analysis Division. Your fiscal staff is going to walk through the work session this morning.
Thank you very much. Apologies for that statement. Thank you. Go ahead.
So for the record, Brody Leiser, Fiscal Analysis Division. I will be walking the subcommittee through the work session today on the State Infrastructure Bank that is included in the governor's recommended capital improvement program. After my presentation, I'll be happy to address any questions that the members may have. I believe that we also have representatives from the governor's office and the treasurer's office in the event that the chair would like additional information provided. I know that the fiscal analysts had gone over with the joint full committee members the work session process. Just very briefly, we will be talking about a couple items surrounding the funding recommendation for the State Infrastructure Bank this morning. And this is meant to be a discussion. Decision points will not need to be made today. However, there will be options. Options are presented in your documents that may be considered when this particular recommendation is brought to closing at the subcommittee. So the State Infrastructure Bank, as I mentioned, is recommended as part of the capital improvement program under Project 21-S11. And in the executive budget is referred to as the Statewide Infrastructure and Economic Development Program. This was heard before the subcommittee on March 11th. The governor recommends $75 million of general obligation bonds to fund and launch the Nevada State Infrastructure Bank that's established pursuant to NRS 408.55069. The bank's purpose is to provide loans and other financial assistance to various units of state and local government for the development, construction, improvement, operation, and ownership of certain transportation facilities and utility infrastructure. In addition, funding in the bank could be used as a match to any federal funding that may become available as part of a federal infrastructure plan. I will be discussing later in my presentation on a bill draft request that has been submitted by the governor in conjunction with the recommendation to launch the bank. I would note that the bank is created within the Nevada Department of Transportation and would be governed by a board of directors that I will refer to as the board. Additionally, the statutory provisions require that the governor appoint an executive director to administer, manage, and conduct the affairs of the bank. That statute does indicate that appointment would be to the extent that money is available. On the first page of your work session document, there's a couple issues identified, the 2 bullet points, and again, these are really relate to the recommendation to fund the launch of the bank through the issuance of general obligation bonds. The first item of note is that the statutory provisions under Chapter 408, as they currently exist, would become effective dependent upon the determination of sufficient money being available. Specifically, the statutes read that the effective date on which the director of the Department of Transportation notifies the governor and the director of the Legislative Council Bureau that sufficient money is available to capitalize and carry out the business of the Nevada Infrastructure Bank. As I mentioned, I will be discussing the options at the end of this presentation that the subcommittee may wish to consider, and that will also include a discussion on how the effective date component that I just mentioned could be or may be addressed through legislation. So with the funding, one of the things that I'm going to focus the discussion on today is the timeline to establish the necessary processes and procedures to establish an application process and selection criteria for projects that would be funded through the bank and would require operational expenditures prior to the issuance of general obligation bonds. So while a number of areas summarized in your work session document were discussed during the hearing, given that this would be the initial funding and launch of the bank, I wanted to recap some general overview information on the bank itself. Though launching the bank is a priority of the governor, as communicated during his State of the State, which was delivered on January 19th, and is recommended to address needed infrastructure upgrades throughout the state, as well as a job-creating measure for Nevadans by utilizing the state's general obligation debt affordability. I would note that information was provided by the governor's office and the treasurer's office through the Department of Administration that identified 162 potential projects, and that information was provided following the March 11th hearing and included submittals from the cities of Fernley, Henderson, Lovelock, Reno, Sparks, and West Wendover, as well as Elko County, Nye County, and White Pine County school districts, and projects for the Nature Conservancy. The projects included areas such as, but not limited to, water, sewer, flood control, transportation, recreation, public safety, and street right-of-way issues. I would note that in that response that was provided, which has been provided to all the members on this subcommittee as follow-up from the March 11th hearing, it was indicated that the list continues to grow and that additional projects, in particular for Clark County, were expected to be received by the governor's office. Moving on to the second page of your document, I wanted to note that, as I mentioned, the statutory provisions of the bank are not effective until the director of the Department of Transportation notifies the governor and the director of the Legislative Council Bureau that sufficient money is available to capitalize and carry out the business of the bank. Therefore, there may need to be funding provided in advance of the issuance of the general obligation bonds for the director of NDOT to issue that notification under the existing statutes, or consideration of a statutory change in that regard could address the effective date of the statutes. So just to clarify, with the recommendation to issue the bonds, the authorization to issue the bonds itself through legislation would not provide money immediately, as the bond issuance could not occur until the board was established and had projects identified which would be required and necessary for the state to go out to issuance. The bank under statute is to be administered by the board of directors, as I mentioned. That board currently would consist of the NDOT director or their designee, and all of these would be or their designee, so I won't repeat that. The state treasurer, the director of the Department of Business and Industry, the executive director of the Office of Economic Development, and 2 members of the public appointed by the governor. The application and selection process for projects is subject to discretion of the board pursuant to NRS 408.55071. Therefore, the process cannot be determined or commenced until the board is established and has begun its business. This may require funding of expenditures prior to the Board of Finance issuing recommended general obligation bonds to support the bank. Pursuant to NRS 408.55072, the governor's required, again, to the extent that money is available, to appoint an executive director of the bank in the unclassified service of the state. The executive director would be responsible for administering, managing, and conducting the business and affairs of the bank at the discretion of the board. The executive director's associated costs would be funded from a portion of the $75 million in general obligation bonds as recommended by the governor. However, as previously noted, this may not align with the funding recommendation and the timing of issuance and the necessary steps that must occur prior to issuance. The state typically goes out to issuance in the fall following a legislative session. I would also note that NRS 408.55072 does allow for the executive director to hire staff, again, to the extent that money is available, to carry out the statutory purposes and powers of the bank. Follow-up information from the March 11th hearing indicated that the board members may utilize agency staff from the governor's office, the treasurer's office, and NDOT to assist with getting the processes established to begin financing projects that would create a public benefit and provide job opportunities as quickly as possible. On page 3, at the top of page 3 of your documents, I would note that a budget amendment is anticipated to be received from the governor's finance office. The budget amendment would establish a new budget account under NDOT to record and track revenues and expenditures for the bank. And this would include the executive director position that I had mentioned, as well as any necessary operational costs. Based on preliminary discussions with the governor's finance office and the treasurer's office, it's estimated that these costs will be approximately $175,000 to $180,000 in fiscal year 2022, and between approximately $245,000 and $250,000 in fiscal year 23. I would note that during the March 11th hearing, the treasurer's office did confirm that supporting the operational costs of the bank would be an allowable use of bond proceeds. However, as I mentioned, the state typically does not issue bonds until the fall following a legislative session, and therefore the state's bond issuance practice may impact the timeline in which the bank would be able to move forward given the funding dependencies. The projects to be funded through the bank would be required to be approved by the board, and would just note that the banks would provide financial assistance, which could include debt instrument financing, interest rate subsidies, a letter of credit, loans, or other credit instruments that are defined and allowable under Chapter 408. I would note that in information provided to your fiscal staff, it was indicated that federal funding under the Biden administration for an infrastructure package may become available and may utilize state infrastructure banks as a mechanism to distribute federal funds. Ultimately, it's the goal or intent to get the bank to a self-supporting operation by creating a revolving fund in which fees charged or interest earned and or loan repayments back to the bank would support the operational costs and financial assistance to state and local governments on an ongoing basis. As I previously mentioned, and towards the bottom of page 3 of your documents, and as testified to during the March 11th hearing, the governor's office has sponsored a bill draft request in conjunction with the funding to launch the bank. This bill draft request would expand the types of eligible projects that could be financed through the bank to include transportation facilities, as well as utility, water and wastewater, renewable energy, recycling and sustainability, digital and social infrastructure, and other infrastructure needs related to economic development. Additionally, the bill draft request would revise the makeup of the board and expand the list of agencies that may provide technical support and assistance to the bank. We'll just note for the members at this time, the bill draft request has not been introduced as a bill, but has been granted a waiver effective April 8th. It was further indicated that the bill draft requests or changes proposed through that legislation may enable the bank to take advantage of American Rescue Plan Act funding that is made available for water, wastewater, and broadband infrastructure, as well as to have the structure in place for any future federal legislation that may address infrastructure needs throughout the country on a larger scale. So on page 4 of the document, there are options for consideration that the subcommittee may wish to consider to ensure that the operational costs can be funded to support the necessary steps for launching the bank and ensuring that the board has established the proper procedures and project application and selection prior to the Board of Finance being able to issue bonds. And to also allow the director of NDOT to determine whether funding exists to issue the notification that sufficient money is available to trigger the effective date of the statutes under Chapter 408 that establish and authorize the bank's operation. In regards to the effective date piece that I just covered, if there were legislation, such as the reference bill draft request submitted by the governor, that made the statutes effective July 1st, 2021, for example, the notice requirement may no longer be required. So to address the challenges with funding the bank and operations through general obligation bonds, there are three options on your document for consideration. The first would be to appropriate general funds to support the executive director's position salary and associated costs, as well as other operating expenditures. The second option would be to allow for a temporary general fund advance to support the executive director's position salary and associated costs, as well as other operating expenditures. I would note for the members that existing language in the CIP legislation allows for a temporary advance of general funds for projects that are approved to be funded with bond proceeds. The language requires that the general fund be repaid immediately upon the issuance of the bonds. And so therefore this, I believe the intent here would be that if a general fund advance were authorized or allowed, that bonds would be issued and the repayment to the general fund then would be required within that same fiscal year. The third option that's presented in your document is to authorize the expenditure of the executive director's position salary and associated costs, as well as other operating expenditures, with the use of reserved interest earnings from the Treasurer's Office bond interest and redemption account. After accounting for the $9 million that was swept from this account through Assembly Bill 3 of the 31st special session, the Treasurer's Office has indicated there's approximately $650,000 of interest earnings that may be available and would be sufficient to cover the preliminary estimates for operational needs in the upcoming biennium. On the final page of your documents are decisions to be considered at closing, which cover the three options that I just mentioned. I would note that option number one is to approve the funding for the State Infrastructure Bank as recommended by the governor. As discussed, there are challenges with this recommendation. However, since there have been no requests submitted at this time to amend the recommendation, it is presented here in your documents as an option. With that, Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation. And as mentioned, I'd be happy to address or attempt to address any questions that the members may have. And as noted, we do have representatives from, I believe, from the governor's office and from the treasurer's office on the line.
Thank you so much for that information. I appreciate it very much. And committee, questions, thoughts, discussion. Assemblyman Levitt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation. So I guess my question is assuming that you can secure, or the governor's office can secure $75 million in general obligation bonds, what percentage of that would be dedicated towards the bank or towards the infrastructure needs under the bank? Do we know that, or are we waiting to see if 75 million can be secured, or if it's going to be less? What's the idea there?
For the record, Brody Leiser, through you, Madam Chair, to Assemblyman Levitt. As recommended, the $75 million is intended to fully support the bank in providing the financial assistance to state and local governments, as well as the operating costs. So the entire amount of the recommendation would be intended to support the bank's operation and the bank's ability to provide financial assistance. If I believe your question may also be asking the likelihood of getting $75 million out the door for projects. We did receive, as I mentioned, following the hearing, a list of 162 projects that are identified as shovel-ready projects. What was not provided as part of that information is the dollar amount associated with each of those projects. It's my understanding that the governor's office feels confident in that they can get projects queued up to be financed through the bank and utilize the entire $75 million of bonds if it is approved by the legislature. But you know, that may be a better question to be addressed by the governor's office in that regard of whether or not, what the likelihood is of being able to utilize that entire $75 million over the upcoming biennium.
So just to follow up on that, so is the $75 million the full request for general obligation bonds? There's no other requests for that, or different parts of the different agencies or whatever it is going to utilize general obligation bonding, or is it just the infrastructure bank that's going to try and secure general obligation bonding?
For the record, Brody Lizer, sorry, I hit a button and there's a window on my screen, so hopefully I didn't screw things up. The $75 million component is a piece of the overall recommended general obligation bonds by the governor. In total, about $400.7 million of general obligation bonds are recommended by the governor based on the state's affordability for the upcoming biennium. Of that, approximately $357 million is recommended to support the capital improvement program. Of that, $375 million that's inclusive of the $75 million for the state infrastructure bank. In addition to that, there is about $44 million in general obligation bonds that are recommended to support bond programs overseen by the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. I hope that addresses your question, Assemblyman Levitt.
Yeah, that actually addressed my first question very well. Thank you. Madam Chair, can I have one more question? Just a clarification question on something else.
Sure, go ahead.
So you talked about the general funds being first used for the operational costs for, I guess, hiring staff to do this infrastructure bank. So when you talk about if we have to use general funds first, and then determined by how much general obligation bonds come in, or if any come in to this effort, so are these positions going to be reimbursed back to the general fund first before you do any projects, before you dedicate money towards any projects? Is that the goal, is to reimburse this money to the general fund first?
For the record, Brody Lizer, through you, Madam Chair, to Assemblyman Levitt, under what is shown as option B in your documentation, allowing for a general fund advance, the intent of that would would allow for the advance of general funds to support, say, the executive director's salary costs, as well as any operational costs that are needed. And with the understanding and intent that the board would be up and running and have projects queued up and identified and approved, so that when the state goes out to do its issuance of bonds in the fall of 2021, that immediately upon the issuance, the bond proceeds would then be used to repay the general fund immediately. So the under option B, the intent would be, to have the general fund repaid in its entirety for whatever is advanced to support those operations.
So the request for the general obligation bonds as far as projects, and there would also be a request for that reimbursement.
That would be, yes, it would be part of the issuance and included as use of the bonds to be issued.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair, for indulging me. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. I believe Assemblyman Roberts is next in.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a quick question so the premise of the fund is once it's up and running, it's self-sustaining for its staff. They wouldn't be coming back every session for continued funds for staffing.
For the record, this is Brody Leiser, Madam Chair, through you to Assemblyman Roberts. The short answer is yes.
Okay. And the other quick question, you probably covered this in the March 11th briefing, but I don't recall. I know we're loaning local governments monies out of the bank and they repay it at an interest. And what is the interest for that? Is it, obviously it's going to be a deal for them. I'm just curious to what range that is on what they repay.
Thank you. For the record, Brody Leiser, Assemblyman Roberts, I believe that that is something that would need to be determined by the board. Okay. And so I don't believe that a rate or percentage has been determined at this point. I think that's part of would be part of the requirements or procedures and policies that would need to be established once the board of directors is established and up and running.
Okay. Thank you very much for the answers. Thank you, Madam Chair, for the questions.
Thank you very much. Senator Kiekefer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Mr. Leiser, if the projects all need to be identified prior to the issuance of the bonds, what happens if we only identify successfully $50 million in projects that meet all the criteria that ultimately get outlined by the board? Does that mean we just leave sort of $25 million in bonding authority and capacity sort of on the table and we're not going to use it this biennium?
For the record, Brody Leiser, Madam Chair, through you to Senator Kiekefer.
You can go direct, Mr. Leiser, please.
Thank you. Appreciate the question, and I apologize for not having addressed that in my presentation. The authority to issue $75 million would be that, just authority. And I'm sure that the Treasurer's Office will wave their arms if I get something wrong here, but the practice of the state typically has been to issue in the fall. So if the board were up and running, had developed and identified the processes necessary to have projects go through an application process and make selections on which projects were going to be funded, in the example that you gave, let's use $50 million. The state would go out, the Board of Finance, would ultimately determine that sufficient information is there to issue. would go out, say, to issue $50 million in the fall of 2021 to get those projects going. Following that, I would believe that the board of directors would continue to solicit applications for potential projects. And in the following fall, for example, the fall of 2022, if additional projects had been identified and approved by the board, the remaining $25 million could then be issued to support those projects. In the event that, say, only $50 million was able to be identified and approved by the board, and the other $25 million was not issued, I believe that $25 million would roll to a future biennium's affordability.
I appreciate that clarification. In discussions regarding the potential allocation of federal funds to or federal stimulus funds to the infrastructure bank, would that be in lieu of these general obligation bonds and supplant the need for some of that geo debt, or would it be, has it been discussed as supplemental?
For the record, Brody Leiser, my understanding is that any federal funding that may become available would be supplemental to the $75 million in state general obligation as recommended by the governor. And that, as I mentioned, potentially the $75 million could be used as a state match if there was any match requirements as part of federal funding that does become available. And as I think everyone on this call is well aware, we're all anxious to get the federal guidance on any federal money that may be available. But I would note that in the American Rescue Plan Act, there is a portion of the funding that has been approved is specifically for investments in water, sewer, and broadband infrastructure. And I believe that the governor's office, the BDR submitted by the governor's office, would align statute under Chapter 408 so that that projects would be eligible for those types of projects, or funding would be eligible for those types of projects that is anticipated through the American Rescue Plan Act. Again, we're waiting for guidance, and I think everyone's aware there's also certainly discussions with the Biden administration pursuing a larger infrastructure federal stimulus plan that may or may not come forward.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think finally, Madam Chair, so if I'm looking at the total number that we'd be looking to front load in order to get the bank up and running, is that in conformance with the ranges that are on the top of page 3 of the work session document, so upwards of about $430,000 over the biennium? Is that right?
That is my understanding. Sorry, for the record, Brody Leiser. That is my understanding, Senator Key.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. I believe Assemblywoman Carlton had a question.
And thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm hearing some of these questions, and this is a little bit different than what we've normally done in the past, because we're having a conversation about setting up this bank, but yet we haven't gotten the bill draft yet, so we don't understand what some of the different components are as far as the policy goes. So I guess my first question would be is this all contingent upon the bill draft passing? If that bill doesn't make it through the system, this will not go into effect. correct?
For the record, Brody Leiser, the Assemblywoman Carlton, the statutes exist under Chapter 408 for the bank to be launched. And so to answer your question, I don't believe that the governor's bill draft request is required to launch the bank, as existing statute has the structure in place for the bank to be launched if funding or sufficient money becomes available. I believe, and this is maybe where the governor's office may want to address the question, if I state this incorrectly, as I understand it, to launch the bank as recommended by the governor, the changes in the bill draft requests are part of that recommendation. And so I think that they do work in conjunction with one another, but the legislature could approve funding to launch the bank and do so without the referenced bill draft requests.
If we could ask the governor's office to, 'cause typically we have a policy discussion first, and then it comes to the joint committees, and then we go from there. But because the bank had already been set up but never funded, it's a little bit different situation. So I think a lot of the questions we're getting are probably more related to the bill draft than they are to the bank. I understand exactly what we're trying to do with the bank. There were reports years ago about overall across the country, we needed almost $4 trillion in infrastructure. So I think it's important. I mean, the last I looked, we got like a D+ for our infrastructure. So there are definitely needs out there. And I always look at our CIP bills and the things that we do as our jobs bill. It's very important legislation that we pass. So I guess I'm just trying to understand how the pieces of this puzzle will fit together. And when I see open-ended kind of terms about exactly what we're going to be looking at, I had never put economic development in with infrastructure. So I guess I have some questions about that, how economic development fits in there. So if the governor's office is available to maybe give us some ideas of what their thought process is on this, and Mr. Leiser, I'm not sure, but will that BDR, do we know, will it be coming back to Finance and Ways and Means, or will it be going to a policy committee? Do we have any indication on that? And that might be more for the governor's office also.
For the record, Brody Leiser, I think until we see the actual language of the bill, I can't answer that question. Assemblywoman.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Leiser. Assemblywoman, I see Ms. Brown on the line. Perhaps she can weigh in on some of this for us. Would that be to your liking?
That's fine. I just think it would be nice to have some more information as we move forward, since we are doing this a little differently than we normally would process.
Correct. I agree. So Ms. Brown, if you have any information for us, please go ahead when you're ready.
This is Susan Brown, Director of the Governor's Finance Office, and I am going to throw this to Eric Jimenez in the Treasurer's Office.
Thank you, Director Brown and Madam Chair. Eric Jimenez with the Treasurer's Office for the record. To answer your question, Assemblywoman Carlton, if the BDR did not pass, the bank could still be funded, but I want to caveat that existing statute only allows for transportation facility infrastructure and utility infrastructure. So if the changes were approved today for the CIP, we could fund those types of projects. But I would caution, I would think that we would want to expand that definition to take advantage of potential federal funding that we already know is available for water, wastewater, and broadband as well.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, we've already made the first set of public policy decisions on what we would like to fund, but there's a lot more need out there, and the changes in the BDR will allow us to be able to address all those other needs outside of what's currently delineated in the scope of what they can do.
Eric Jimenez, for the record, that's exactly right, Assemblywoman. I think the playing field has changed since the bill was first passed in 2017. And I think this is a perfect opportunity for the legislature to work collaboratively with the executive branch to see what types of projects you would envision being funded under the bank.
And I guess the economic development question probably isn't appropriate at this time. I believe that would probably be more appropriate at the BDR level, or when the bill is actually heard. But since I have you, Mr. Jimenez, and Madam Chair, if I can, so if we're talking about Rescue Act funding, and it could possibly coming in, are you going to be looking at blended financing on some of this with some federal and some state, so that we can bond part and maybe take our 75 million in our buy-in and maybe make it last, extend it out a little bit? Has that been talked about?
Eric Jimenez, for the record, yes, Assemblywoman, and I think we are looking at that for every type of project that we're considering. So you know that under the American Rescue Plan, state and local aid is a permissible use. We don't have guidance on it for water, wastewater, and broadband. There's also a separate capital projects fund, which the state also doesn't have guidance on for projects directly related to work and directly related to education. So I think with the money that we have on the table right now, the intention is for these state dollars to go as far as possible. And I believe a question was answered on March 11th to Senator Ratty. The intent would be for this to be a revolving fund, so those funds could continue to be used.
Oh, and I understand the revolving fund part of it. I'm just trying to figure out how the Rescue Act dollars will work, and if it is going to be blended funding, that allows that 75 million. If we go 50-50 on it, that turns it into $150 million worth of jobs and projects out there. So I just wasn't sure exactly, and this is your world. So I'm just asking questions so that we build a record, because there's no way am I an expert on any of these issues. So thank you very much, Madam Chair. I think it's an important issue. And it's just a bit hard to wrap my brain around, because we have a bill draft we haven't seen yet. So we don't really know what the policies are going to be looking like. But yet we know money needs to be put there so that we can get the work done. So thank you very much for the latitude and the questions.
Thank you for the questions. I'm sure many of us have the same ones. So thank you very much. Additional questions, Senator Sievers-Gansert, please.
Thank you, Chair. Let's see if I can turn my little hand off there. Okay, just kind of following up. There's been a discussion several times about the federal dollars, and we're not quite sure how the federal dollars can be used, but do we know how much money is in that bucket? So do we know the amount of dollars that are available?
For the record, Brody Leiser, Senator Sievers-Gansert, we don't know the amount that is available for the component of the act that identifies that funding can be used for investments in water, sewer, or broadband infrastructure.
Okay, and then
so no, the answer is no.
Okay, thank you. And I would agree with some of my colleagues that the structure is going to be really important, because in looking at 408, it is limited to transportation and utilities, and we're broadening that. And you're creating a new board. I really didn't find a board in here. And so when we contemplate the board, I think we need to, the membership that was suggested sounded good, sounded like the right direction. But I also know when we have transportation projects, which is something that we frequently use, of course, for federal dollars, and we blend dollars, we always make sure that's a balanced board as far as regional too. So I think you said that NDOT director, treasurer, head of business and industry or designees, economic development, and 2 public members. So when the policy comes around, I think we're going to need to look at making sure that it's balanced. And I do see that this money can be used for economic development, because when you look at transportation projects, and maybe you can answer that, maybe this is more of a question. I think the leverage is really high. I think it's like 10 to 1 or 8 to 1, depending upon the project. So I don't know if Brody, if you know what the typical leverage is for federal, a typical match required for federal dollars, at least in transportation, because that'll kind of give us an idea of how we potentially can leverage this money and whether 75 million is the appropriate amount or if it should be something else.
For the record, Brody Leiser, unfortunately, Senator Severs-Gansert, I don't know the answer to that question. We'll be happy to follow up as your fiscal staff. Okay. I cannot answer that.
Thank you. I appreciate that the structure has somewhat already been created as far as 2017, and that we need to modify this, because I think there's a pretty significant opportunity to invest in infrastructure that's truly important for the state. So I look forward to the policy bill so we can review that together. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Additional questions or thoughts?
Madam Chair?
Senator Keffer, please go ahead.
I just have a follow-up that was prompted by one of Mr. Jimenez's answers. So if we do end up sort of mingling different sources of funds into this account, from an accounting perspective, how will that work in terms of ensuring that we're not using federal dollars to match federal dollars? Is it all just going to be fund mapped out to make sure that if we are going to be trying to draw down federal dollars, that we're not using stimulus funds? I don't know if that prohibition will be there still, but I think it may very well be.
Eric Jimenez with the Treasurer's Office for the record. Thank you, Senator. And this was something we had contemplated as we've been kind of working through this bill draft. I think in the existing statute, it is defined purely for those 2 sections of federal and non-federal dollars for utility and transportation facility infrastructure. We are attempting to try to create flexibility in that, understanding that we want the board to have discretion on what sort of accounts it can set up, but also making sure that the funds can be used for those intended purposes. So I think the answer to your question is, Senator, yes, we're thinking about that, but the goal right now is just to make sure that we can be as flexible as possible.
Yeah, I appreciate that, just without getting us in trouble, right? Thanks.
Thank you very much. Additional questions or thoughts? Okay, seeing no hands, Mr. Leiser, any additional information that you need to give us before we move on?
For the record, Brody Leiser, Chair Nde Administrative. No, I think that covers my presentation. Again, these will be considerations that are brought to the subcommittee when the capital improvement program is presented for closing, which at this time is tentatively scheduled for the first week of May.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your time and your expertise. And with that, we will move on to budget account 101-2710, the COVID-19 funding. And I believe, Ms. Mangoba, are you starting us out today?
I apologize, Madam Chair. This is the budget hearing, so I believe the Department of Education may have some presentation.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure I was in the right order, and I wasn't. So thank you very much for answering. So we'll go to Department of Ed.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For the record, State Superintendent Joan Ebert, thank you for having us here this morning. As we start out, we're bringing our slides up. we always start with our mission, values, next, equity, access to quality, and our goals, which, as you all are aware, we spent quite a bit of time across the entire state moving in this direction. So for today's presentation, we are specifically addressing how we are aligning funds to the State Board of Education COVID-19 response and recovery. The State Board of Education spent quite a bit of time with our constituents looking at, across the board, K-12, actually pre-PK, all the way through higher ed, because we know we have a phenomenal opportunity during this crisis to look at those metrics, looking at the way we do business, and then also capitalizing off of the changes that have been made because of COVID in a very positive way, and amplifying those resources, tools, and skills that our community has built. So as you see here, closing opportunity gaps for students who've been traditionally underserved, safe, efficient, and equitable reopening of school buildings, access to technological capacity, social emotional, access to high quality professional development, high quality instructional materials, support for our parents, families, and communities, access to adult education and workforce development opportunities. You will see all of these goals reflected in the proposals that are being offered to you today. And so with that, I turn the time over to our Deputy Superintendent, Heidi Hartz.
Good morning, members of the subcommittees. For the record, I'm Heidi Hartz, and I serve as the Deputy Superintendent for Business and Support Services at the Department of Education. We have two budget amendments to present to you today. The first is Budget Amendment A21, 585, 2710, and it will include funding available to the state through the Coronavirus Response, Relief and Supplemental Appropriations Act, also referred to as CRISA. The second amendment is Amendment A21, 586, 2710, and that pertains to funding that has been received by the Department of Education through the American Rescue Plan Act, also referred to as ARP or ARPA. Previously, Budget Account 2710 has been a non-executive budget account. Beginning in fiscal year 2020, the Department of Education used this budget account to document the receipt of federal funds that had been allocated to Nevada in response to COVID-19 response and recovery activities. Initially, those funds that were accounted for in this non-executive budget account were appropriated by the federal government through the CARES Act. The practice that has been used up to this point in time is that the Department of Education prepared a series of work programs. First, to establish the revenue authority in the non-executive budget account, and then identifying and preparing subsequent work programs that recorded the receipt of the revenues transferred out of Budget Account 2710 into NDE budget accounts, and then also tracked the expenditures that corresponded to that. The work programs were done in an effort to align the expenditures within the applicable budget accounts within NDE. That's created a rather complicated process for us because we do have federal funds related to the CARES Act and the CRISA Act across multiple budget accounts, which makes it difficult and a little bit cumbersome to identify what has been expended at any point in time. The recommendation to create Budget Account 2710 as an executive budget account would allow us to receive and expend all funds from all three pieces of federal legislation in a single budget account, which would increase transparency, efficiency, and also accountability, and allow us to prepare our reports and our financial analysis in a more expedient process. The slide that's on the screen now, please go back one slide, provides an overview of the funding that has been received by the state of Nevada's Department of Education for what is referred to as ESSER or ESSER 1, ESSER 2, and ESSER 3. I would note that ESSER 3 is also being referred to as ARP ESSER, relating that it is funded through the American Recovery Plan. This slide shows the funding period for each of the federal funding acts, as well as the award deadline. The Department of Education, as all state educational agencies, are required to have awarded all CARES Act funding by May 2021, to award all CARISA funding by January 2022, and to obligate all ARP funding to local educational agencies within 60 days of receipt, and the balance of the funding within 1 year of receipt from the federal government, which has been set at March 2023. We've identified the total amounts of funding awarded to the Department of Education in Nevada. We've identified the 90% allocation that is designated specifically for local educational agencies, as well as the 10% that's available to the Department of Education for statewide priorities, and the subset that is available for administrative costs incurred by the Department of Education. The purpose for each of the federal funding sources is identified. The activities that were supported through the CARES Act were preventing, preparing for, and responding to COVID-19. CARISA includes those same priorities and then expands those priorities to include addressing learning loss, preparing schools for reopening. And I would note that preparing schools for reopening can include facility repairs and improving indoor air quality. ESSER 3 or ARP ESSER is used for the same purposes as ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, and additionally can be used to address learning loss through evidence-based interventions and implementing public health protocols in each of our schools. While the federal funds may be used for expenses incurred back to March 2020, the Department of Education has recommended to all of our LEAs and other contractors and subrecipients, and will continue to do so, that the funding be expended in the current fiscal year or subsequent fiscal years. Going back and replacing funds from a previous fiscal year that's already been closed out can create some audit concerns as well as some financial accounting challenges. This slide provides a similar comparison for the funding that's been received for GEAR or GEAR 1 and GEAR 2. For GEAR 1 funding is available through September 30th of 2022, while the GEAR 2 funding is available through September 30th, 2023. Both grants must be awarded within 1 year of receipt from the federal government. So GEAR 1 is to be awarded or obligated by May 2021, and GEAR 2 is to be fully obligated by January 2022. We've identified the amounts of funding awarded to the state of Nevada, specifically the Department of Education. You will see that under the CARISA column, the GEAR 2 funding does include approximately $19 million, which is specifically reserved for emergency assistance to non-public schools. Eligible private schools have the opportunity to apply to the Department of Education for funding that would allow them to safely reopen schools, to continue instruction, address learning loss, support educational technology needs, and to be reimbursed for previously incurred expenses attributed to COVID-19 responses. The purpose of the GEARS funding is consistent across both the CARES Act and the CARISA Act. The superintendent previously provided an overview of the statewide priorities that have been identified by the Department of Education in collaboration with the State Board of Education. As the superintendent noted, these priorities have served as our guiding principles for funding decisions throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, and they were taken into consideration when developing the expenditure plans for the CARES Act, for CARISA, and for ARP. The first budget amendment that we'd like to review with you in more detail this morning is Budget Amendment 21-585-2710. This includes ESSER 2 funding totaling approximately $48 million and GEAR 2 funding totaling approximately $12 million. If this budget amendment is approved, this would allow NDE to fully obligate all funding awarded through CARISA within the first year of the funds being available to the state, beginning in fiscal year 2022. The Department of Education has developed proposed budget expenses for the SEA reserve, as well as the SEA administrative costs. The next several slides provide an overview of the administrative costs anticipated by the Department of Education. The budget amendment includes the continuation of funding for 5 temporary employees the fiscal year 21 funding for these 5 contract employees was previously approved by the Interim Finance Committee on April 1st, 2021. This budget amendment continues the funding for these temporary positions through the end of the funding period for each federal funded grant. I would note that these are temporary positions, which would allow us not only to expedite the hiring process, but also to be respectful of the work that needs to be done. If a particular area of work is completed prior to the end of the grant period, then the Department of Education would have the flexibility to end those contracts with those temporary employees because the work has been completed. Today, our budget amendment is also requesting additional funding for some additional temporary employees. What we have designated as an administrative oversight cost would be for the addition of 1 auditor or management analyst equivalent position in our compliance unit. That position would be responsible for assisting with risk assessments for each subgrantee or contractor, which is a requirement that must be done prior to the award of any funds according to the federal regulations and guidelines. This position would also assist the department in ensuring that our grants management policies and procedures are in alignment with the federal requirements that have been established for these emergency response funds. That would include CARES Act, CARISA, and ARP. We want to do everything in our power to make sure that we are ensuring that these funds are spent appropriately and in accordance with the federal guidelines. On the next slide, we have identified some additional Nde Administrative Costs, which would include expanding the functionality with Infinite Campus by adding a component that would specifically provide information for school counselors, school nurses, and other employees to identify the social and emotional needs of our students as they return to in-person instruction. This is expected to be a one-time expense and would total $150,000. Additionally, we have budgeted $260,000 specifically to target school-based behavioral health services. This would allow the department to contract with a temporary employee in order to provide services over an 18-month period of time to ensure that services are available in each school district and to ensure that the availability of services yield equitable access to all students. The $260,000 would also include $50,000 for a contractor to expand Medicaid billing capacity for our local education agencies, as they have the ability to request reimbursement from Medicaid for applicable services provided to eligible students, and the revenue that they collect can then be used to reinvest in continuing to provide mental health support services to our students. Additionally, $10,000 has been budgeted to update online modules, which would assist our local educational agencies with embedding trauma-informed school practices into their work within each of their school districts. The Department of Education has also budgeted $799,000, which would allow us to integrate and increase the accessibility of information through web-based resources. This would include hiring a consultant to conduct an external audit of public-facing documents currently included in the Department of Education's website. It's anticipated that these costs would total approximately $49,000 and would result in an RFP being developed that would allow us to hire an external company to redesign the NDE website. The estimated cost of that work is $750,000. Again, these would be one-time expenses. Lastly, the department anticipates $25,000 in expenses in order to build out the e-page functionality to allow school districts to apply for their federal funds using this capacity. E-page is the process that we currently use at the Department of Education for subrecipients to apply for state and federal grants. Each time we add a grant to the e-page system, we do need to pay the vendor to build out this functionality. Thank you. With respect to the SEA reserve funding, the department has identified approximately 20 projects, which we will go over briefly with you. I would also note that a summary of each project was included in this budget amendment when it was submitted to the Governor's Finance Office and in turn to the Legislative Council Bureau Fiscal Analysis Division. The projects that have been identified do tie to the statewide priorities previously discussed, as well as to the CARISA priorities. And the projects that have been identified target the educational spectrum, from early childhood education through high school graduation, college and career readiness, professional development, and continuing the development of the teacher pipeline. With respect to closing opportunity gaps for students who have been traditionally underserved, the Department of Education has recommended approximately $4 million to be budgeted to hire a temporary position equivalent to an educational programs professional to work with school districts, school leaders, educators, and stakeholders to then utilize national best practices and evidence-based resources to design programming that would support students who are not able to graduate from high school in the traditional 4-year timeframe due to the circumstances that may have been created by the COVID-19 pandemic. This also includes funding that would provide an incentive for students who chose to participate in completing what would become their 5th year of high school to again ensure that all of our students are graduating from high school. Additionally, approximately $21 million has been budgeted to incentivize pathways for teaching. These funds would be used to provide stipends to those who are completing coursework for pre-service teachers who are doing their student teaching or in their final 3 semesters at an NSHE institution or another educator preparation program. It is believed that this will help us to strengthen our teacher pipeline and to retain and support, which will then allow us to support students in their progress towards completing their educator preparatory programs. We have also included approximately $3 million to support pre-kindergarten access to students in the state of Nevada. With the additional $3 million, the Department of Education would propose the addition of 376 seats. That would be in addition to the funding that was previously approved by the Interim Finance Committee for fiscal year 2022 that would have added additional seats in recognition of the costs previously paid through Zoom and Victory services to support pre-K services. If this budget amendment is approved and becomes part of the governor's recommended budget, this would allow the department to have funding available for a total of 2,943 seats in fiscal year 2022, funded at the governor's recommended average per seat cost of $8,410. The Department of Education has also budgeted approximately $1.6 million that would support access to college level coursework for our students across the state. This is based on a projected or assumed cost of $100 per course times 16,000 credits. This would also include funding to allow the build out of functionality to report dual enrollment data within the Nevada report card. The next project would be the Strategic School Improvement Planning Platform. This is budgeted at $1 million and would include the purchase or build out of a statewide digital platform for school performance plans, district performance plans, and comprehensive needs assessments that inform those various plans. Having an electronic platform to capture this information and to update this information will support efficiency and consistency and would allow the department and the school districts and individual schools to replace what is currently a paper-based system with an electronic system, which allows the system to be more responsive and more robust. With respect to the goal of returning students to buildings so that they can benefit from in-classroom instruction, the department has requested or budgeted funding for $6 million for the development of a uniform and integrated financial management system. During the 2019 legislative session, Senate Bill 543, it did include an IFC contingency fund appropriation on behalf of the Department of Education to support this expense. The Department of Education went through the request for information process in order to gain better information on the estimated cost and scope of work for this financial management system. The department also worked with EATS in order to obtain approval for the TIN. The department had prepared a work program to seek release of this fund, which was anticipated to go to the Interim Finance Committee in April of 2021. Ultimately, that request was withdrawn due to the need for the state to address the financial crisis that had resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic. We still believe that there's a tremendous benefit not only to the department, but to our school districts to have a uniform financial management system and to strive to replace many of our paper-based systems for requesting reimbursement, processing payments, and building budgets for school district subgrantees with an electronic system. With respect to social and emotional support of students in response to COVID-19, the department has budgeted $7.5 million, which would allow for the training and hiring of 100 additional school mental health professionals. This is in response to school districts and charter schools who have identified their need to not only retain their existing school-based mental health professionals, but to hire additional licensed providers to support their staff and their students as we move through pandemic recovery. This funding would also allow for an expansion of a project that is currently underway in Clark County School District, which is the Lifeline Project, which has been designed and implemented to respond to students dying by suicide, which has then increased the demand for services to support students in a significant way. Additionally, the department has budgeted $1.7 million to support the hiring of 17 multi-tiered systems of support coaches to assist school districts and schools across the state to address the immediate needs for additional interventions in the recovery phase of the pandemic. The department would enter into a contractual agreement with an NCHE institution in order to hire and train these 17 individuals, recognizing that the hiring would be limited to the terms and conditions of the contract and the immediate needs of the state. $150,000, as I mentioned previously, was budgeted to expand Infinite Campus to provide additional information to our school counselors and nurses so that they can better address the needs of students and identify students in needs of additional supports. The budget amendment also includes $330,000 to sustain Safe Voice. This includes additional funding to continue the funding of the Safe Voice platform, which has been previously provided through a grant to the Department of Education, and that grant is expiring on December 31st of this year. The $330,000 also includes $140,000 for DPS personnel so that they would have funding necessary for their personnel dispatchers who answer phones 24/7 for the Safe Voice program. I would note that in the Department of Education's budget hearing, we were asked if the general funds we had requested through a budget amendment and the governor's recommended budget could be replaced with federal funds. Including these dollars in this budget amendment is reflective of honoring the request that was received from LCB staff. Additionally, I would note that it is my understanding that DPS did have a budget amendment that was approved during their budget closing hearing that would fund the $140,000 for the DPS personnel. And we also appreciate the fact that the money committees may choose to proceed differently when they get to full committee closing based on the availability of federal funds for this expense. The department has also budgeted $380,000 to support restorative justice activities. This would result in a contract with a national provider to provide evidence-based training and coaching for school district staff and school resource officers across the state, with the goal of creating approximately 20 trainers in the area of restorative justice and practices to assist staff and students through the recovery and renewal phases of the pandemic. This expertise is a significant gap in the state of Nevada, and it often hampers our efforts to advance equity and decrease disproportionality in student discipline. Within the area of high-quality professional development for educators in addressing learning loss, the department has recommended $1 million for professional development focused specifically on the science of literacy. The intent is to contract with external experts in the area of early literacy and the science of reading to support resources that would allow for professional learning opportunities to be implemented statewide at no cost to the educators who are receiving the training. This professional development will support educators in accurately assessing reading proficiency and providing interventions and supports to improve student outcomes in reading that may have been impacted during the last year as students were learning in a variety of settings. Within the priority area of access to high quality and instructional materials for educators and students to address learning loss, the Department of Education has budgeted funding to continue contracts that were previously established early in the COVID-19 pandemic. That would include an additional $2 million to expand the contract with Canvas Learning Management System. This was previously funded at $4 million for a 2-year period of time. This would allow us to extend the contract for a third year. I would note that Canvas is currently being used for school districts that opted into this service, and it is allowing to simplify the process that teachers utilize to evaluate learning and to provide educational materials to their students. Currently, there are over 550,000 users using Canvas across the state. This includes educators and students from various school districts and charter schools. The department has also budgeted an additional $1.5 million to continue access to the Mayan digital library. In January, the Interim Finance Committee approved $500,000, which would allow the department to provide these services for a 6-month period beginning in January and ending in June 2021. The additional $1.5 million would allow us to continue the contract for an additional year through June 30th, 2022. The Mayan digital library does provide students access to thousands of materials that are available online and can be downloaded to be reviewed at a later time. Nevadans so far have read more than 40 million minutes since the implementation of the Mayan programs and services. The department has also budgeted $2.2 million to continue the digital discovery education experience. This proposal would extend the existing contract beyond its current expiration date into September 2024. This platform keeps students connected so that they can continue learning whether they are at home or at school, and it provides additional information on a wide array of subjects, including math, science, and social studies. To date, 95% of all schools in Nevada have utilized this service. Between September 2020 and March 2021, over 15,000 educators and 200,000 students have been actively using Discovery education resources. Within the priority area of supporting parents, families, and communities, the department has budgeted $2 million in total for translation services. $470,000 is projected to be expended from ESSER 2, and the remaining $1.5 million is projected to be expended from the ARP ESSER funds. As the department indicated in previous work programs, one of our weaknesses is providing information that is available in multiple languages that represents the diversity of our families and their children. We look forward to investing these funds in order to be able to better communicate with all that we serve in and across our state. The department is also budgeted $810,000 to continue the work of the Nevada Digital Learning Collaborative. This collaborative was formed early on in the COVID-19 pandemic and has allowed subject matter experts to come together to begin building out digital learning materials, and to provide professional development to teachers who are learning to teach in a digital platform, learning how to better address the needs of students. Within the area of access to adult education and workforce development opportunities, the department has budgeted a total of $450,000, which would be paid for through a combination of ESSER funds and ARP ESSER funds. These funds would be awarded to the Jobs for Nevada's graduates use the Pathways to Careers to develop an education-focused labor market data dashboard, which could then be used to align CTE courses and pathways to the local labor markets and assist students in finding employment opportunities. This would also result in the development of math curricula, specifically Algebra 1 and geometry, which would be provided to students to support career exposure and preparation, particularly in high-value career pathways. Madam Chair, would you like us to pause at the end of the first budget amendment or continue through the second budget amendment and hold questions till the end?
Maybe we'll have some clarifying questions real quick. I know that there are a couple people that would like to get some information. So Assemblywoman Carlton, would you like to start out here?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate that. So I think one of the overarching questions, the 60,000 view question is, these are one-time dollars. And I appreciate the rundown of where we're looking at putting some of these dollars, what some of the suggestions are. So it's my understanding, because they're one time, these will not get built into the base in an ongoing fashion. That's the first part of the question. But some of the dollars are being used to, I'll just use the term backfill, where some cuts were. So in essence, those will still be part of the base in the future. So could you expand upon that, please?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, you are correct. Because these are federal funds, they would not be built into the base budget moving forward, with one caveat. And that is, as we move forward to the 23-25 biennium, if we do have any remaining funds available, they would be in the base budget, that they would be found within budget account 2710. So they would be easy to isolate and to identify that these are indeed one-time funds and not intended for ongoing expenditures beyond the period of performance identified by each of the federal pieces of legislation that authorize the funds. For the funds specific to pre-K that are serving as a backfill, they are indeed one-time in nature. And so the department would continue to look for alternative ways to fund these types of services, recognizing that moving forward it may be necessary to request a budget enhancement to restore some of the funding that may have otherwise been available for pre-K services in the upcoming biennium.
And thank you, Ms. Hartz. That made it pretty clear for the record. And for those that will be here for the 23-25 discussion, I think they want to be cognizant of the fact that because they're one time, they will be included, but I think we have to be very careful about that base discussion, because we'll be growing something without knowing where we're going to fill it from. So thank you for clarifying that. A lot of my other questions, Madam Chair, actually go to individual specific, I guess we'll call them programs in this. So I'll wait till later, but I just wanted to get that addressed right off the bat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I just wanted to give people a time to get a little bit of clarification, and then we'll move on and we'll have more questions at the end. Assemblywoman Benitez Thompson, did you have a quick question?
Mine were more about the conversations on the programs and the specific budget amendment. So if you are going to take that at another time, I can hold on.
All right. Anybody else have a clarifying question before we move on? Okay, not seeing any hands. I think most people have questions on programs. So, Ms. Hart, if you'd like to move on, please.
Thank you, Heidi Hartz, for the record. The second budget amendment for presentation and consideration today is Budget Amendment A21 585 2710, and it includes funding for the ARP ESSER or ESSER 3 funding, totaling $714.6 million. This includes funding specifically for LEA allocations as prescribed by the federal law, totaling approximately $643 million, funding for the Department of Education for the SEA reserve, totaling approximately $53 million, and then funding for the Department of Education administrative costs at approximately $3.6 million. If this budget amendment is approved, this will allow NDE to obligate the funding that has been awarded to the state and released for the state's expenditure as of March 2021. The U.S. Department of Education has been trying to expedite the availability of funding to states across the country while balancing the need to have states submit a formal application for the funding. What has happened to this point in time is that the U.S. Department of Education has released funding for 2/3 of the total amount of funding available to each state, indicating that they anticipate they will release their application sometime this month. Once the application has been released, then the Department of Education will submit its formal response. Upon submission and approval of the application, the balance of the funding will be released to the state of Nevada. I would like to note for the benefit of the subcommittees that this budget amendment reflects the projects and priorities that have been identified and vetted as of April 1st, 2021. The Department of Education continues to work on a daily basis to develop the programming and the expenditure plans that would correspond to addressing the priorities that have been identified in ARP. We have been updating our plans and activities based on input we have been receiving, and we intend to solicit larger stakeholder engagement prior to providing our application to the federal government for their final review and approval. So the funding for the school districts would be available for the school districts to submit an application indicating how they would invest those funds to benefit the needs of their students. The ARP funding has been particularly targeted at identifying learning loss and promoting enrichment programs through summer school, extended day learning, and other additive learning opportunities. For statewide investments, the Department of Education has identified four projects for your consideration in this budget amendment. Those include additional funding for translation services. As I mentioned, the department has identified that this is a tremendous gap for the Department of Education and one we are very focused on addressing as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. It would also include funding for Education First, for a partnership with Donors Choose, and the balance of funding for the Youth Careers Pathway platform that I previously discussed that would be developed in partnership with JAG. Again, the Department of Education did provide one-page summaries for each of these projects to your staff, but I will go over them quickly for the benefit of the subcommittee and those who are viewing the hearing online today. So the Education First is a project that is currently underway within the state of Nevada. FIRST stands for Inspiration and Recognition of Science and Technology. This is a robotics community that prepares young people for the future through a suite of inclusive team-based robotics programs for students in pre-K through grade 12 that can be facilitated in a school or in a structured after-school program. Tesla has currently invested in establishing the Education First program in approximately 200 schools in our state. With the additional investment of $10 million over the course of 2 years, the state will have the opportunity to expand this investment so that every pre-K through 12 school in Nevada would have access to this beneficial educational program. The Department of Education has also budgeted $8 million for a collaborative partnership with Donors Choose. In the past, Donors Choose has had successful partnerships with counties across the state where they have invested ESSER funds to directly fund projects identified by teachers in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Nevada has been invited by Donors Choose to be the first state-level investment opportunity in teachers' projects. With the recommended investment of $8 million, this would create the opportunity for Donors Choose on behalf of the Department of Education to fund approximately 10,000 teacher projects at an average cost of $800 each. The ability to serve or to provide funding for 10,000 projects would represent supporting approximately 1/2 of the teachers in the state of Nevada. This would allow teachers to identify projects or needs that they have as they continue to provide educational services in their classrooms or in hybrid settings. And as I mentioned previously, we did include the balance of funding for the Youth Careers Pathway in the ARP application. Once the Department of Education has submitted its application to the U.S. Department of Education and received approval to obligate all of its funding, the department will return to the Interim Finance Committee to request approval for the remaining ARP funding. This work program would be estimated to be at an amount of approximately $357 million, and it would include the remaining 1/3 allocation for the school districts, totaling approximately $322 million, the balance of the SEA reserve, totaling approximately $34 million, and the balance of the SEA administrative costs, totaling approximately $1.8 million. With that, Madam Chair, we'd be happy to answer any questions specific to this budget amendment or to the projects proposed for funding through both budget amendments.
I appreciate that. Thank you very much for that information. And I believe Assemblywoman Garlow, do you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, I actually have 2 questions. The first is regarding the expanding access to the college level coursework that was for 1.6 million. Could you elaborate a little bit more on how that would expand the dual enrollment programs?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. This would provide an opportunity for more students across the state of Nevada to have access to dual credit courses. Currently in the state, we have a variety of options that are used to provide dual enrollment to our students that varies by school district. This would allow us to establish some uniformity and then also to make the opportunity again available to more students.
Thank you for that answer. And then going on to the Uniform Financial Management System, since it's been delayed, do you have a revised timeline for implementing it?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. When the Department of Education previously requested funding during the 2019 session, our goal was to be able to implement that within the biennium. So we would still hope to be able to implement that within the biennium. If not, then within the funding period that's been established for the federal funding sources that would be utilized for this purpose.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to jump in there really quick because I want to know what factors are going to be considered when you allocate the mental health funding. And it will be across the state. Am I correct?
Good morning. This is Christy McGill for the record. So some of the factors that will be factored in, we'll be looking at ratios and need and also availability of the workforce.
So can you clarify that? When you say availability of the workforce, do you mean the amount of people that are actually available or clarify that for me just a little bit, please.
Sure, Christy McGill, for the record, you are correct. That would be the availability of the workforce and the people that have license that are able to go into our schools.
So if we don't have that, if we don't have enough people to use that funding, will that funding sit there as we continue to work towards having the appropriate amount of people?
Christy McGill, for the record, we will also be looking at internships and paid internships as well to move people through the pipeline. So that will be another lever that we can go through. And then also if we don't have the ability, in the past, we have moved funds around different districts to where they do have the workforce capacity.
Okay, thank you. I see several people in the queue. I'll go to Assemblywoman Carlton.
And thank you very much, Madam Chair. And it's really a follow-up on what you were just talking about, using one-time funding to hire people. And I noticed in the chart that I have that it's just listed under fiscal year 22, not 23. So if someone could address that, and I just have concerns that we're going to go out and try to hire people, but we're only going to fund them for a couple of years. A lot of folks don't want to take a job for just 2 years. So could you address that also, please?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. With respect to some of the contractual services that we have anticipated in the upcoming biennium specific to our COVID-19 response and recovery efforts, we have identified funding in fiscal year 2022, recognizing that that will be our first priority and our most emergent need. Certainly, we want to make sure that we have sufficient resources available as our children return to in-person learning, either during summer school sessions or in the fall when then the academic year begins. Certainly, if funds are not expended in fiscal year 2022, then we would balance them forward into fiscal year 2023. Again, our priority right now is to address the most emergent needs that we anticipate will exist as children are returning to the classroom.
And thank you, Madam Chair. So that answers the question. So the proposal is funding it in 2022, and then whatever's not used roll into 2023. How long are the contracts that you're going to be setting up with these mental health professionals? Are they just 2-year contracts?
Christy McGill, for the record, that will be based on district decisions. Districts contract for mental health professionals sometimes in a year or 2-year basis based upon their pipeline. Also for the reason of billing Medicaid in these 3 years of getting districts to bill Medicaid to sustain, the mental health professionals will also be an important lever.
Okay, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll have other questions as we get further into the discussion on some of the other items. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And I see that Senator Keykefer has a question, and then Assemblywoman Kadeki.
Hey, Madam Chair, I want to take sort of just a quick step back and talk a little bit bigger picture. So I want to understand, I think, what the plan and expectations are for moving into an executive budget account for these funds. So obviously with the ESSER 2 funds, those are being allocated basically on a line item basis, considering what's in the budget amendment. From what I understand, there might be a little bit left over that we haven't authorized if we approve the budget amendment. But in the ARP funds, it looks like there will be probably at least $80 million that are not, of state funds that are not accounted for yet. So what, I mean, I guess what's the expectation for how those funds will be authorized in the future? Do you expect us to just authorize them on sort of a gross amount during the legislative session and then come back through IFC for transfer authority? Or how do you see this rolling out over the next 2 years?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. With the submission of the budget amendment for the ARP funding, we're hopeful to establish revenue and expenditure authority for the funds that have been released to the state of Nevada. We recognize that we have not fully justified all of the expenses, certainly for the SEA reserve or the SEA admin costs. And the Department of Education would continue to work with the Governor's Finance Office and the Fiscal Analysis Division to continue to provide information to the members of the legislature. As I indicated in my prepared remarks, the Department of Education continues to develop those financial and programmatic plans on a daily basis. So what's reflected in this budget amendment is where we were as of April 1st. Work has continued each and every day since then as we continue to identify and fine-tune the projects and activities. With respect to the remaining funding that has not yet been made available to states, including the state of Nevada, and more specifically the Department of Education, we will come back to the Interim Finance Committee with a work program to specifically request the Revenue and Expenditure Authority for those remaining funds.
So so I'm trying to make sure I understand. So we've got about in the allocation that we currently have from the ARP, it's about $53 million. You're expecting another 34 after that. So do you expect to ask for specific authority for programs or specific expenditures for that first allotment before the end of session?
Heidi Hartz for the record. While the Department of Education would hope to be positioned to do that before the session ends, we are reliant on the release of that federal application from the U.S. Department of Education. Until we can see what's in the application and what, if any, additional clarification they have provided regarding the expense of the funds, we are in a holding pattern.
So if in an executive budget account, if we just provide a sort of gross authorization, revenue and expenditure authority to the department, if we're not then transferring those funds into a state agency, they don't even really have to come through IFC, right?
Heidi Hartz for the record. The recommendation and the budget amendments are to make budget account 2710 an executive budget account so that it will continue to be reviewed by the Interim Finance Committee as additional funds are received and changes in expenditure plans require approval.
So any allocation out of the account will require approval from IFC, even if it's not to a state agency, if you were to grant it to an LEA or a nonprofit or a contractor.
Heidi Hartz for the record. It is my understanding that yes, before any funds would be expended from this account, the Interim Finance Committee would have the opportunity to review the proposed expenditure plans.
Okay.
The efficiency that this process creates is that rather than bringing forward work programs that would add funds into the superintendent's budget account and the school support account and the grants management unit, is that we would simply say these expenses are being incurred from this budget account to support these 3 federal grants. So it streamlines the efficiency and effectiveness from a financial reporting and accountability process. It also streamlines our processes for accounting for the funds and processing reimbursements.
I appreciate that. And I don't want to end up back in a scenario where we were in the summer, right? Where we were just being given work programs and it was take it or leave it, and this is how we're going to spend the money. And so I'm just trying to make sure that I understand the process to know that the legislature continues to reserve its authority over how some of this funding gets spent. Thank you.
Heidi Hartz for the record. We do appreciate the opportunity to prepare a budget amendment and to provide as much of this information as possible with the hope that it can be built into the legislatively approved budget. We fully appreciate that in the last year we have processed approximately 50 work programs specific to the CARES Act. That's a great deal of work, not only to be prepared and to track, but also for the Governor's Finance Office and your staff, as well as those serving on the Interim Finance Committee to review and approve as well.
Thank you. That comment wasn't specific to the Department of Education. I appreciate it, Ms. Hartz.
Thank you very much, Senator Kekeffer. I believe Assembly Woman Hudagi might be in the queue. Am I right?
Yes, thank you, Chair. And I had a couple of questions regarding ESSER 2. Well, a few questions, if that's okay, Madam Chair. The non-administrative expenses. I just needed a little bit more information. I know the equity consultant, there's $75,000 in 2022 and then $50,000 in 2023. And from the information we received, it looks like you guys were contemplating between two options, doing either some internal training or some internal and external training with district leaders. And this was specifically to combat the systemic race issues. So can you walk me through a little bit, like what those training programs are going to look like and why this isn't being, I guess, a training that's being provided to all of the districts statewide, and just one of the options is just keeping it internal within the Nevada Department of Education. And then could you kind of walk me through what brought hiring this equity consultant? What kind of, I guess, issues, racial equity issues you guys identified?
Great, thank you for the question, State Superintendent Joan Ebert, for the record. Not only the pandemic, but also the social components that were brought about with the death of George Floyd, and how looking at our data across the entire state. What we needed to do first as a department is step back and hold the mirror up to ourselves and our staff, and how we're supporting schools and what our values are and beliefs, and take that work. So we actually used prior grant funds to work with the National Equity Project this last year. We all, and every single staff member in the department participated. It was very engaging and eye-opening to see where our own biases exist and where we needed to grow. So from that learning, and with the opportunity of these funds being made available, we are going to go deeper as a department, because just like in an airplane, when it's going down, you put the mask on yourself first and then you help others. So we're building our capacity as a department and then expanding it out across the state. We do have specific superintendents that are poised and ready and have been doing this work that want to expand within their school districts. So we're using the department, district leadership, also into the classrooms. Now, that being said, that's just one piece that we're presenting to you. The school districts themselves are working from the ground up with their principals, with their teachers, to change the system. And for the Department of Education specifically, we are looking at policy and practices, removing barriers for our students so they can succeed and become productive citizens within Nevada.
Thank you, Superintendent Ebert, for that answer. That's very helpful, and I appreciate you guys taking the initiative to get this training done. I have another question on the non-administrative expenses. Down the 17 coaches to assist districts in, I guess, writing additional intervention for COVID-19 pandemic recovery. What does that intervention look like? This is just so I can have some clarity. I know it's $850,000 in 2022 and $850,000 in 2023 for 17 coaches, and these coaches are supposed to provide immediate need for COVID-19 intervention. What does COVID-19 intervention look like?
Good morning. This is Christy McGill for the record. And one of the lessons we learned with COVID is when schools had multi-tiered systems of support in place, they were more equipped to take on the different needs of students and staff. So we're taking this lesson and applying it to districts and schools that want to learn and go deeper into multi-tiered systems of support. Multi-tiered systems of support is a systematic way to address tier one, which is universal good practices, like good teaching and prevention. Tier 2 is when a student or group of students start to struggle. There are immediate interventions for that student. And then Tier 3 is that clinical intervention or really intense intervention that meets the need of the student. And so to make sure that we have equitable systems is we want to walk by the sides of our districts and schools and help them build these multi-tiered systems of support. Based upon the multi-tiered system of support are our mental health workers and our Medicaid plans. And so having that systems approach will really help. A very concrete example of a district that quickly took on the multi-tiered system of support with their Lifeline project is Clark County School District, really trying to meet the needs of their students in that Tier 3 model. Now they know they have to do more work and making sure they have Tier 2 services and Tier 1 services to get to reduce the number of kids needing those Tier 3s. So it's a complete system. It takes time to build out. We need the additional people to meet the schools and the districts where they're at and to help build that systemic approach.
Thank you. And Madam Chair, if I could, just 2 more questions.
Yes, please go ahead. If I could interject just one thing as an educator right there, Assemblywoman Hadige, if you'd so indulge me, I just want to make sure that for non-educators, the Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 system is something educators know. That's not just an NDE thing, or it's not just a COVID thing. That is actually a system that we're aware of. So I just wanted to make sure, if I could add that remark. Go ahead, please, Assemblywoman.
Thank you, Chair. I want to jump and then go to the incentivizing pathways to teaching program. I know you said that this would help strengthen the teacher pipeline, but could you give me just a little bit more details about how this is going to work? And specifically, I'm more interested in how candidates are being selected for this program.
Thank you, Superintendent Ebert. For the record, as we actually have heard, what we know across our state is that as people who want to enter the profession of teaching, we have non-completers. And that is because of the student teaching component. They either have to quit their jobs that they currently have, and then they no longer have income to participate in student teaching, or they need to find a new job. And so this is for those students who will become educators in that last year when they do their student teaching. This provides a stipend, just like in the medical profession, when we have people going to become doctors, they do have stipends that are provided. This is to help with our teacher pipeline, and so that we will have completers. What I was going to reference earlier also was that we had testimony in Senate Education. There is a bill moving forward for support staff within school districts. They would like to become educators as well, and it is has been a documented roadblock for many in our state. When we produce educators that live in Nevada, that participate in education, they stay here in Nevada, and that's what we are hoping to continue.
Thank you, Superintendent Ebert. And I guess that sort of answered the first part of my question, but the second part about how candidates were selected. So this is going to be available to every student then that's in their last year, or is it just going to be available to those that you guys identify as non-completers that maybe dropped out? Or
Heidi Hartz for the record. At this point in time, our intent is that educator preparation programs would apply for the funds based on the number of pre-service teachers that are expected to begin their student teaching experience. Each program would then be responsible for the distribution of the funds to the recipients within their program. We would also note that the department does intend for these funds to be used in conjunction with the Teach Nevada Scholarship and any other grant scholarships that may be available to these students. If accepted, each student who receives these funds must obtain a teaching license and seek employment in a public school within the state of Nevada. So those parameters would be established between the Department of Education and the educator preparatory programs that would be receiving the funds. They would in turn establish those criteria with those students that they would be awarding funding to for this purpose.
Okay, so then it's the incentivizing pathways to teaching program is giving money to the education prep programs, and then the education prep programs are establishing the requirements for the students who will receive the funding. Did I get that right?
Heidi Hartz, for the record, yes, that is the way the program is contemplated for implementation at this time.
Okay, perfect. I would be curious once this program's up and running just to see how the students, because I'm assuming each education prep program is going to set different requirements or parameters around how they select the students to receive these dollars, these stipends. So I would be interested in seeing how the students are selected once it's up and running. If that's information we could get provided to us. And then just my last question, Madam Chair, it's just with the Strategic School Improvement Planning Platform. Could you just walk us through how this will actually improve K-12 education? I know you said it's going to support efficiency but I'm not being in the education world. I'd like to just get a little bit more information. I know you said it was moving from paper to electronic, which is fabulous, but if you could just give me a little bit more information on how it'll improve education.
So the Department of Education has been working with school districts and schools across the state to identify their school improvement plans, both at a district and a school level. As we've been working with the school districts and schools to improve the process, we've made tremendous progress and great strides in creating consistency and transparency and establishing opportunities for mutual support in working to ensure that we are investing in improving each of our schools across the state. So the ability to purchase or build out a statewide digital platform for the collection of these plans, and then to also collect comprehensive needs assessment information will be incredibly helpful because it will allow the information, again, to be collected in a digital platform. It will be something that can be easily updated or modified, and it can then be used across the entire department for applicable projects. Currently, we have a variety of grants that have a needs assessment component, and our local school districts must respond to those needs assessment components each time they're applying for federal funds, and that can be quite a cumbersome process for them. So having this digital platform will create efficiency for the school districts as well as for the Department of Education. And it will allow for consistency across the entire state because the components of those plans will be uniform in nature.
Thank you, Ms. Hartz. I appreciate your answers. Okay, Madam Chair, thank you so much for your indulgence in my questions. I appreciate the time.
Thank you very much. And before I think Senator Ratty, did you have a question? And then Senator Sievers-Gansert.
Yep, just a couple quick ones, just so we make sure we get on the record. Could we just talk a little bit about the duties and responsibilities of each of the 8 contract positions recommended using the elementary and secondary school emergency relief funding?
Heidi Hartz, for the record. So the duties of each position would vary by the position type. For example, we have requested funding for 2 management analyst equivalents that would be located within our grants management unit. So they would be responsible for administering the subgrant agreements from a financial perspective with each of our local educational agencies, processing requests for reimbursement, tracking the expenditure of the funds, and ensuring that reports are collected as needed to satisfy the reporting requirements of the federal government and any state required reports. Similarly, the educational program professional equivalents would also support subrecipients in the development of their proposals for the applications for funding. They would also assist in reviewing any reports and reviewing any proposals to revisions in the intended scope of work for each subgrantee. We did request funding previously and would continue to fund a project manager who would be responsible for the daily oversight of the 3 federal funding sources in making sure that the Department of Education continues to meet the various reporting requirements for each of the 3 sources of federal funding, and making sure that the work that the department is doing and in turn our subrecipients and our contractors are consistent with federal and state regulations and guidelines. A number of the projects that were discussed today would be led by contracted staff. Again, the work that they would perform would be specific to the project that they are assigned to.
Thank you. And then on the high school graduation incentives, how are they going to be allocated and provided to students?
Heidi Hartz for the record. The Department of Education is still working with our school districts to identify the best way to administer these incentives to students who are choosing to continue to attend school in a 5th year in order to obtain high school graduation.
Okay. And then finally, can you just talk a little bit about the timeline of when the department would determine how to use the remaining 2.9 funding that's available, 2.9 million, I should say, funding that's available for unadministrative expenses?
Heidi Hartz for the record. I believe you're referring to the ARP funding. And as I indicated, the Department of Education is building out our budget proposals and program proposals every day. What's reflected in the budget amendment is reflective of where we were as of April 1st of 2021. The final expenditure plan and program plan will not be determined until we receive the application from the United States Department of Education. We want to make sure that whatever plans we have moving forward are in alignment with any additional requirements or expectations they may establish in that application process. U.S. Department of Education has indicated that they hope that application will be available this month.
TBD, basically, is where we are on that. And I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. I believe Senator Severs-Gansert had a question.
Thank you, Chair. So there's hundreds of millions of dollars that are coming down to the state. And I think, kind of backing up, the Department of Education has a certain role, and then you've got your school districts and so forth that have certain roles in how to best use this money. And today, we have, I think it's 20 different programs. And when I look at these programs, it looks like about 12.6 million go to students, whether it's the 5th year seniors or incentive programs or dual credit. And then we've got about 3.75 for mental health, and then 21 million for the teacher pipeline. And then we have, I think, about $80 million that's yet to be allocated. So one of my questions is sort of in the definition of what's Department of Education, and the rest of it is like platform and software and things like that. So I guess sort of the broad question of the role of the Department of Education, and then also the metrics around how this money is spent. And I'm sure the federal government's going to require some metrics, but tracking the money and making sure that it's being utilized and that we have some successes, whether it's the 5th year senior program or we have very little information about what these incentives can be. And I think that was $4 million. It was quite a bit of money to incentivize kids, I think, to go back to school and to finish. So I just want a little discussion about the metrics and the role of the Department of Education, because after this money is spent, there's another 700 million or so that's going straight to the districts. So could you help me with that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you for the question. For the record, Joan Ebert. So we have many moving parts, right? And I think I know you've alluded to many of them. We have, almost in this last set of funds, it's total almost 1.1 billion. those funds are much different from the first two set, ESSER 1 and ESSER 2. In the fact that there are components, not only the Department of Education, but the school districts themselves must receive community input, and they also must, to your point, look at data and information before deploying projects and whatnot. There is also in this last set of funds, which they did not contemplate in the first two, ESSER 1 and ESSER 2, in that 90% this time, 5% must be identified for learning loss, 1% for summer, at least 5%, at least 1% for summer enrichment, at least 1% for after-school programs, at most 2.5% for other state activities, and then you have the administration overhead as well as the non-public school funding as well. In those funds, we are to also look at equity allocation. So these funds are made available, but the application for them has not been put out, as Deputy Hartz noted. We're hoping to see that this month. So we're moving forward with what our current understanding is with the law. And then once we receive final confirmation through guidance, we'll continue to move forward. The funds that go to the school districts are reimbursed. So I think some people have asked quite a number of questions of, do the school districts, the 90% is allocated to the school districts. However, it is not just given straight out, it is in a reimbursed fashion with the Department of Education. And so we always look at those components to make sure they are allowable expenses that have been put out there. With all of these moving parts, and you can see the Department of Education, the thought process being building out the infrastructure so that we can then serve and support long-term, also building capacity within the school districts themselves, and then building out the pipeline for the workforce. Those are the main components that we've been looking at, and we'll continue to monitor and report back to the legislative body on our progress.
So thinking about the funding formula that we've had in the past, now we've got the pupil-centered funding plan. Some of the cuts that have been proposed are to the read by grade 3 and also the class size reduction. And that's been part of the role of general fund and the Department of Education, is to make sure that we've got funding for those types of things. And so we're moving to this new formula, but we're cutting some of the major components of what we've had before. So have you considered using some of the Department of Education funds, so your allocation, to restore some of the programs that we know have been very helpful to our districts and to our students, really? I mean, when you think about literacy and math and what really moves the needle on students' student outcomes.
Thank you for the question. For the record, Superintendent Ebert. Yes, we have, as you can see first in the governor's proposed budget, those components that are there. In these dollars, the pre-K, expanding pre-K seats, not only inclusive of restoring those seats, but expanding. We also, with the Safe Voice, and was previously during one of these meetings recommended that we look at those dollars as well. And so PK, those components, the learning loss that has transpired across our state, and then also continuing the infrastructure. So those are just a few that I would note right now. If there's one specifically that you would like us to dive into, more than happy to, but the overarching, looking at the goals within our own state, the direction from the State Board of Education, and the governor's direction as well as how we have proceeded.
So thank you. And, kind of circling back to some programs that we know have been successful, like the Read by Grade 3, and then we know that it's helpful to have smaller classes. I think it is, and I think there's probably evidence to support that. I'm hopeful that you can consider that with the other $80 million that's unallocated right now, because I think literacy is important. And when you look at our numbers, we finally are on par at fourth graders using the NAEPS test. And if you look at the curve, that went up when that was converging with the national average. Math actually changed its trajectory too. And so, and I know we've done more than that. I know we had the Victory schools and we had the Zoom schools, and that's part of the equation. But that thinking about students being able to read by grade 3, if we want to change the trajectory from now on for those students and students who follow, it would seem to me that those are super important programs that should be considered, and they're not here. We have all kinds of programs, and not that much, to be honest with you, are around our current students. And the pipeline's super important. So about half the money's pipeline, and then we've got the mental health, and we have a lot of platform and software dollars, and only about 12.6 around the 5th year students, the dual credit, the pre-K, and then the $4 million for incentives. So, and again, it's sort of what role does Department of Ed have, and what have we done in the past that's been successful? So I'm hoping that you consider those programs. And then my last comment, or was kind of the first comment, but I'll circle back to it, was around the metrics, how we use this money and the success that we have, because maybe there's some things that we want to continue to do as we help to bridge this gap, right, in education. So how do we get this recovery on the road and then continue to reset the trajectory of how our students are performing in our state? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Senator. And I would just like to make sure that we get on the record that we have not cut read by grade 3, and I couldn't agree any more with you that how important those funding mechanisms are. We have not cut those. They are now encapsulated into that new funding formula, Senate Bill 543 from the 2019 session. So I just want to make sure that we go on the record that those listening to us are clear that we did not cut that funding.
Madam Chair, I thought it was cut $31 million. I thought it was restored and they backed out $31 million. So maybe Fiscal can help with that.
Mr. Hartz.
Madam Chair, I would defer to Ms. Mangoba if she has the answer readily available. If not, we will provide it to you.
Thank you. Ms. Mangoba, do you have that?
For the record, Jamie Mangoba, it is my understanding that it was reduced in AB3 during the special session, but the governor recommended budget recommends to restore that funding and to be transferred to the People Funding Center funding plan. But to give you a more accurate details, we could follow up with that.
Yeah, I think we restored it, and then I think we cut it again. And so I think that's the piece that we need to figure out whether we did or not, because I believe that there was a restoration and then there was about a $28 to $31 million cut when it got transferred over. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And we'll go to Assemblywoman Carlton, please.
And thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I had some questions, but just to follow along this conversation, we're not done with that yet. It's just mid-April, so to start characterizing cuts before we finished our work, I don't really think is appropriate. It sends the public the wrong message. So I understand where we are with it, and until we finish, that decision hasn't totally been made. I think my questions are more along the lines of, I'd like to get into some of the components of some of the funding in the non-administrative expenses. And I'm going to be really honest with you. I had never heard of Donors Choose before, and they're proposed to get $8 million, and it's going to be $800 to be distributed to 10,000 teachers. That's less than half of the teachers in the state. And we know the complications that we ran into when we tried to give $500 for supplies or $300 for supplies to teachers, and the accountability and making sure the money actually got spent on the projects. So if someone could just kind of walk us through exactly what this nonprofit will do, how they'll make sure that the money actually goes to the projects, what the reporting and the deliverables will be back to the state as far as these dollars go, because even if we give them to someone else, it's still ultimately our responsibility to make sure that those dollars get spent appropriately.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Carlton. For the record, State Superintendent Ebert. We as a state have been using Donors Choose for many years. We've actually received, classroom teachers have received over $12 million for projects. And this is a global entity. We have 9 school districts that are actually signed up as partner school districts. And so what happens is that a teacher makes a determination that they want to do a specific project within their classroom, whether it's a garden. We have flexible seating that teachers have proposed for their classrooms. And the average, the data that we worked with Donors Choose is through all of these thousands of projects the teachers in Nevada have applied for. The average first time ask is right around $800. So that's how the $800 came about. What happens is a teacher puts in online that they would like to have a specific project funded. They then work with the Donors Choose staff, and whether it is, ordering textbooks for, not textbooks, excuse me, additional supplementary materials, all of those components. They build out the project. They identify all of the components to deliver the project, and then Donors Choose. So the teacher now does not have to do any of the ordering. Donors Choose does all of the ordering and then sends it directly to the teacher. During the pandemic, they sent the materials directly, in some cases, to teachers' homes so that they could be used because they were not in school buildings. I'm proud to say that during the pandemic, most states actually saw a decrease in requests for Donors Choose projects, but Nevada saw an increase during this time. And so a few things, and being an educator, as you know myself. Number one is it starts with the teacher and the classroom identifying their specific needs to carry out a project and their desire. Number two is they receive supports from Donors Choose to build out the project. There are people that review the projects and say, hey, maybe have you thought about XYZ, so that it is a complete and comprehensive project that they apply for. Number three, the teacher, me as an educator, I do not have to do all the ordering and hope that it gets shipped. All of that is handled by Donors Choose. Number four on all of this, which is really critical, is that through these projects and having it linked through Donors Choose, there are specific donors, and we're hoping that it will be amplified for our educators, that donors at times target specific projects. So most recently, there was a donor, a private donor, that wanted to specifically target social justice projects. So Donors Choose has the capacity to look across all of those projects that teachers have submitted, and that donor funded every single project from a teacher that was in regard to social justice. You'll have people that target gardening projects and other things as well. So we're hoping that this initial investment in our teachers actually having their projects amplified will then double the funds that teachers receive in Nevada.
And thank you, Ms. Ebert. I appreciate the long answer, but I just need to get to the other questions too. So, but there was nothing in there about the deliverables. So we're going to be giving them money. In the past, it has not been state money. They've done it through private donations. So now the state is actually going to give them $8 million. they'll be providing us all the documents on how the money was spent?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, yes, project by project.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. On the inspiration and recognition funding, so it's my understanding that it's going to kind of continue what Tesla has sort of been doing in the STEM programs across the state, and it will be across the whole state. Is that correct?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, that is correct.
Thank you. And when I'm looking at the Career Pathways platform, it's developing an education-focused labor market data dashboard. That's very similar to a lot of the work that Owen does and Dieter does. So I was just wondering about if we needed something like that, would it be better to partner with the folks who actually do this? And what was the thought process behind doing it here and not in the other agencies if this was needed?
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, so it is in collaboration. We work very closely with Owen. I do not believe they're positioned to do the complete project that we're asking, but I will double check with staff to ensure that it is number one, yes, we are working collaboratively with Owen, and that number two, check that Owen cannot do the work that we're asking. I will re-verify that.
Okay, we are going to subcontract that out again. So I always just want to make sure that if we're going to contract with someone, if there's a state agency that can perform some of this for us, it just helps us take those dollars and make them go a little bit further in another area. And also in some of the conversations earlier, there was some talk about translation services. And we have the Office of New Americans. And I was just wondering, has the Department of Education been partnering with the Office of New Americans to possibly get some of those translation services addressed? Because I know it has been an issue that has been bubbling up over the last couple of years.
Superintendent Ebert, for the record, thank you for the question. The state has 3 contracts with translation services that we use. And I believe the Office of New American also uses those contracts as well.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just always want to make sure that when we do send this money out, I see the amount that is going to be left with that. I'm a little concerned about just the half of the amount of teachers being able to apply for this, but it seems as though that not every teacher would actually have a project, and these are all fairly small dollar projects. So my only concern is the same that we had when we did the supplies, to make sure that the money actually gets spent on the projects. Thank you very much, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much. And I believe Assemblywoman Benitez Thompson is next.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I'm going to be so quick because I know we're racing up against the clock. So I think there's been so much good conversation, and I just wanted to, get my 2 cents on the record. So one, most of these just so needed, absolutely in love with the projects, and excited about the fact that we're going to be able to have pots of money to spend on some of these things. Just a couple of things that are on my mind that I want to get to the top of the record. One of them, Assemblywoman Carlton just touched on, but it was on translation. I think that one of the best and highest uses we could spend on some of these federal dollars are on the tech and software, paying for the services within translations, within our softwares, because we just, no matter what we do that we think is equitable, if we're only speaking it in one language, then it's not equitable. And so more than anything else, it's a software application now, and anything we can do to help the districts or school districts pay for those packages or pay for those enhancements to get lots of languages, then let's do it. That will serve us well and service exponentially down the road. And I see that there's one pot of money in 2020 for that, and then another pot of money in 2023. So if I was going to ask a question of the department, it would be of those dollars that are being allocated, which look to be about $2 million. How far does that get us in terms of translations? I see grade report cards, but I don't know if that means just report cards for one district, report cards for two districts. So if there's some way that I could get some way to quantify how much those dollars, that $2 million will move us forward in terms of translation equity, that would be helpful. So I have a way to hold that in my head. Second would be, I think you've heard me say this before, I'll say it again. Also something that Assemblywoman Carlton just touched on, but in general, when it comes to the nonprofits, it's always, you know, I'll say fruit of forbidden tree, although I don't think that's the best analogy, but there are so many nonprofits out there that do wonderful, wonderful things. And then we're the state, and some of the stuff that the state funds is not so exciting and sexy and glamorous and like these one-time specific pots of money. But what we do is really important, right? And so I think that before we look at funding nonprofits to do the work, we look within ourselves to say, how do we do this work? If we're missing a piece like science and robotics, then how do we organically support the programs within our school districts that do that anyways before we look to an outside nonprofit? Because the more we can do to build up our own infrastructure, the less we're going to be dependent on looking to outside organizations to do that for us. And I just believe that that's our mandate to try to make all of that happen. And then also with that science piece, I know that when I was out last year, when I could go to a school in Sun Valley Elementary School, I was talking to that principal about what she needed. She said, we need help with dollars for science because we've got teachers that have to teach a science curriculum and we don't have one. So the schools that have more money can purchase those science kits. They can purchase little erosion kits, or they can, you know, purchase trout eggs, and they can do science units. But, you know, we have a whole chunk of our schools that don't have a budget for buying those science kinds of programs. And so I think that, once again, looking at what the need is in the school district and what our principals and teachers are trying to do and allocating money there seems more sense than handing it to a nonprofit. And then I think that's it. Everything else that I kind of wanted to make sure I stated was talked about. The mental health funding as was touched about, just the concern that we're funding it in 1 year and not in the second. And so just once again, a better understanding of how that plays out in the real world with those contracts and those professions we hired. That's all I got.
Superintendent, did you have a response to that? I know there was a lot in there.
It's okay, Madam Chairwoman. I didn't need a response because I know we're running up against the clock. I just wanted to say, here were my thoughts. And
okay,
then,
got it. Okay, thank you. Additional questions from anyone on the committee? Okay, I'm not seeing any more hands. I don't see anybody needing to ask a question. So with that, I thank you very much, Nevada Department of Education, for the information and the overview. And I'm sure that this will be on the agenda at a later date. And with that, we will I think I just wanted to make sure I didn't miss anybody. And with that, I believe we can adjourn our meeting today.
Madam Chair, would you like to do public comment this morning?
I surely would. Chair Carlton, thank you for the acknowledgement of that. I'm clearly not on the game. Thank you so much. And with that, we'll go to public comment.
Thank you, Chair Dondero Loop. If you have recently joined the call and would like to provide public comment, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Caller with the last 3 digits of 577, please slowly state and spell your name for the record. You will have 2 minutes and may begin.
Good morning, Chris Daly, DALY, Nevada State Education Association, the voice of Nevada educators for over 120 years. While NSEA is optimistic about the availability of $775 million in federal funds made available in these K-12 budget amendments, we are concerned about the lack of educator voice in the development of programming for these significant dollars. Meanwhile, NSEA implores the legislature to continue the work to address structural state underfunding of public education. Since the beginning of the pandemic, NSEA has consistently raised concerns that districts lack resources needed to safely operate school buildings during this pandemic. Educators have also long expressed concern about education inequities and the lack of social and emotional support for students, both before and especially during this pandemic. Federal ESSER funds will provide critical financial relief for school districts to address the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on students and to safely operate school buildings over the next 2 years. NSEA applauds the leadership of the Biden administration and congressional leadership for making the latest round of funds available through the American Rescue Plan. We also want to acknowledge the work of Nevada's congressional delegation along with our parent, the National Education Association. Leading up to the passage of the ARP, NEA members wrote hundreds of thousands of messages and placed thousands of calls to their representatives advocating for Congress to pass this package containing the largest investment ever in education funding. While the NEA and NSEA played a central role in the passage of federal funds, we are concerned about the lack of educator voice in the development of programming for these funds in Nevada. This lack of engagement with frontline educators is concerning the NSEA. This morning's hearing was our first opportunity to hear NDE's proposed uses of funding, and we still haven't seen any detailed budget documents. This makes it nearly impossible to provide thoughtful input. For example, one of the allowable uses of ARP funds is the protection of education-related jobs. This is a use where we would appreciate the opportunity for constructive input on proposed allocations. Also, we know these federal funds will only serve as a temporary patch for Nevada's chronically underfunded schools expiring in 2023. Before the pandemic, Nevada ranked near the bottom of states' most education metrics. And we know that Nevada has the largest class sizes in the country, as the legislature must deliberate a proposed $156 million cut from class size reduction for the next biennium. We ask the legislature to move new sustainable revenue forward to address this structural state underfunding of public education. Thank you.
Once again, we are currently on public comment. If you have recently joined the call and would like to provide public comment, please press *9 now to take your place in the queue. Chair, there are no more callers wishing to provide public comment at this time.
All right. Well, due to the lateness that we have been on, I'm assuming that most of our public comment callers would have called in. So with that, I would adjourn the meeting and thank you all for your good questions, and we will see you soon on the floor. Thank you.